The extra table was set up in the corner of the sunroom, separated from the main dining table by approximately 12 feet, and whatever invisible boundary my mother-in-law had decided, at some point during her holiday preparations, constituted an appropriate distance between the family and my daughter. Sophie was 9 years old, sitting alone at a folding card table with a paper tablecloth, eating Christmas dinner off mismatched plates, while 8 feet away, at the formal dining table covered in my mother-in-law's best linen and china, 11 members of the Hartley family ate, laughed, and passed dishes around with the comfortable ease of people who have always known exactly where they belong. I stood in the kitchen doorway, the same kitchen I had spent the previous 3 hours cooking in, the same kitchen where I had prepared the majority of the food currently being eaten at both tables, and I watched my daughter eat Christmas dinner alone at a card table in the corner of a sunroom, and I felt something shift inside me that would not shift back. "Mom," Sophie said, glancing toward me with an expression that was trying very hard to be fine, the particular expression children develop when they've already understood that making an adult feel guilty about something is both possible and somehow their responsibility to avoid doing. "Can you sit with me?" I crossed the sunroom and sat down across from my daughter at the card table, in a chair that wobbled slightly on the uneven tile floor, and I smiled at her with every ounce of warmth I possessed. "Of course I can," I said. And then I looked, over Sophie's shoulder, at the formal dining table where my husband Marcus was laughing at something his brother had said, where my mother-in-law Eleanor was presiding over the seating arrangement she had created with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had organized things exactly according to her own preferences, and where every single person currently occupying a proper seat was a Hartley by blood. Every single one except my daughter, who sat at the card table in the corner because she was mine from a previous relationship, and therefore, according to whatever internal calculation Eleanor had performed while planning this Christmas dinner, belonged at a different, lesser table than the real family. My name is Rachel. I have been married to Marcus Hartley for 4 years, and before I tell you what happened in the months following that Christmas dinner, I need to explain something about our living situation that the Hartley family had somehow, despite its direct relevance to their own futures, never fully absorbed. But first, the context that makes that Christmas dinner make sense. Marcus and I met 6 years ago, when Sophie was 3 years old. Her biological father had left our lives before she was born, a departure so complete and so absolute that Sophie, at 9 years old, had no memory of him and no particular curiosity about his absence, simply because Marcus had been the consistent male presence in her life since she was old enough to form lasting memories. Marcus adopted Sophie 2 years into our marriage, a legal formalization of a relationship that had already functioned as father and daughter for years by that point. He was, genuinely and completely, her father in every way that mattered, and Sophie called him Dad with the uncomplicated ease of a child who had never needed to think carefully about the terminology. What Marcus's family chose to do with this reality was something considerably more complicated than simple acceptance. Eleanor Hartley was, by any objective assessment, a formidable woman. 73 years old, impeccably presented, presiding over the Hartley family's social and domestic life with the confident authority of someone who had occupied that role for decades without serious challenge. She had strong opinions about family, about bloodlines, about what constituted a real Hartley, and while she had never articulated these opinions directly to my face in language I could straightforwardly confront, she had communicated them through years of small, deniable gestures that, assembled together, formed a picture as clear as any explicit statement could have been. Sophie was not a real Hartley. She was Marcus's adopted daughter, which Eleanor distinguished, through linguistic choice and behavioral pattern, from being Marcus's actual daughter, as though adoption were a legal technicality rather than a complete and permanent familial bond. This distinction manifested in small ways throughout the 4 years of my marriage, ways I had initially attributed to generational attitudes about adoption and blended families before gradually recognizing them as something more deliberate, more specifically designed to maintain a hierarchy. Eleanor considered important Christmas and birthday gifts for the Hartley grandchildren, of which there were 6 at the time of that Christmas dinner, were selected with evident care and personalization for each child, specific interests acknowledged, favorite things remembered, gifts that communicated genuine individual attention. Sophie's gifts from Eleanor arrived in consistent patterns that differed subtly but unmistakably, slightly less expensive, slightly less personalized, occasionally items that seemed chosen with minimal information about who Sophie actually was as a specific child rather than as a category of person. Family photographs displayed in Eleanor's house told a similar story. The wall in her hallway featured a comprehensive documentation of Hartley family milestones, grandchildren's school photos updated annually, family portraits from various gatherings. Sophie appeared in some of these photographs, specifically the ones that included Marcus and me as a couple, but was notably absent from the dedicated grandchildren wall, where 6 small framed school photos were arranged in a carefully maintained display that had, in 4 years, never expanded to 7. I had raised these observations with Marcus on several occasions over the years, and his responses had evolved through predictable stages that I think many people in similar situations will recognize. Initially, alternative explanations, his mother was simply traditional, generational attitudes took time to shift, Sophie was newer to the family than the other grandchildren and things would naturally equalize over time. Then, as specific incidents accumulated beyond easy individual explanation, a kind of exhausted acknowledgement, yes, he'd noticed, no, he didn't think it was entirely fair, he would talk to his mother, he understood this wasn't ideal. The talking to his mother that he claimed to do produced no observable change, which led me to eventually conclude that either those conversations were considerably less direct than Marcus characterized them, or Eleanor's response to them was so dismissive that he'd stopped pushing after minimal resistance, unwilling to pursue a conflict with his mother that he clearly found deeply uncomfortable. What I hadn't done, across 4 years of observing this pattern, was connect it clearly enough to what I now understood was happening, that Eleanor's differential treatment of Sophie wasn't simply cultural lag or accidental inconsistency, but a deliberate, ongoing communication about who she considered legitimate family and who she considered peripheral, tolerated because of Marcus's attachment rather than valued for their own place within the family. That Christmas dinner forced the connection I had been avoiding making. Because what made that extra card table different from all the previous small slights, the slightly lesser gifts, the missing school photo, the comments Eleanor occasionally made about family resemblances that somehow always managed to exclude Sophie from consideration, was that it required deliberate action rather than simply unconscious omission. Someone had to specifically decide that Sophie would not sit at the main table. Someone had to physically set up a card table in the corner of the sunroom. Someone had to provide that table with paper tablecloth and mismatched plates while the main table received linen and china. Someone had to arrange 11 chairs around the main dining table while ensuring that the 12th person, the one who didn't belong at the main table, would have somewhere else to go. That someone was Eleanor, and she had done all of this before anyone arrived, with the calm, unhurried thoroughness of someone executing a plan she'd had in mind long before the day itself. I understood this with complete certainty because of something I observed while carrying dishes from the kitchen to the dining table earlier that afternoon, before anyone else had yet sat down. That I passed through the sunroom with a bowl of roasted vegetables, and I noticed the card table already set up in the corner, already provided with its paper tablecloth and mismatched plates, already positioned exactly where it would eventually ensure that Sophie ate Christmas dinner approximately 12 feet from the rest of her family. At that point, Sophie was outside in the garden with her cousins, all of them bundled in winter coats, chasing each other around the bare-limbed trees with the uncomplicated energy of children who hadn't yet been seated for dinner and didn't yet know where that seating would place them relative to each other. The card table was already set up. The placement was already decided. Before Sophie had come inside, before any adult had signaled which child belonged where, Eleanor had already arranged the dining room to communicate, in physical, spatial terms, exactly where my daughter stood in relation to the rest of this family. I set the bowl of roasted vegetables on the main table and stood in the sunroom for a moment, looking at the card table in the corner, processing the specific coldness of deliberate exclusion compared to the more easily rationalized coldness of unconscious omission. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't the natural result of a table that simply didn't have enough room for everyone. The main table had room for 12, and we had 12 people attending that Christmas dinner. Eleanor had chosen, specifically and in advance, to use that room for 11 rather than 12, and to provide the 12th, my daughter, specifically, with a separate, lesser arrangement in the corner of the adjacent room. I picked up the roasted vegetables. I carried them to the main table. I said nothing to Eleanor about what I'd seen. But I started thinking, for the first time with genuine clarity and purpose, about something I had been aware of for years without allowing myself to fully consider its implications. About whose house the Hartley family was going to need next year. And the year after that. And every year that followed, for as long as Eleanor's comfortable assumptions about who counted as real family remained unchallenged by the specific reality of who actually controlled the resources that family depended on. Let me explain the secret, because without it, everything that follows makes considerably less sense. 3 years before that Christmas dinner, my maternal grandmother passed away and left me, as her sole surviving granddaughter and the person who had managed her care through the final 2 years of her life, the entirety of her estate. This included a modest investment portfolio, some personal items of sentimental value, and, most significantly, a large property in the same town where Marcus's family had lived for 3 generations, a 6-bedroom Victorian house on 2 acres that my grandmother had owned outright since 1987 and that, at current market valuation, represented a considerably more substantial asset than anyone looking at my ordinary daily life as a graphic designer and stepmother might have assumed I possessed. I had not purchased this property, had not earned it through any particularly impressive professional achievement, had simply inherited it from a woman who loved me and had watched me show up, consistently, and without complaint, through 2 years of difficult end-of-life caregiving that her other relatives had found reasons to largely avoid. The property had been rented to a series of tenants since my grandmother's death, generating income one managed quietly through a property management company, while Marcus and I lived in a comfortable but modest house we'd purchased together early in our marriage. What the Hartley family knew about this property was essentially nothing, because I had never discussed it with them in any detail. Marcus knew, obviously, we were married, shared finances were a reality, and I had never hidden this inheritance from my husband. But Marcus, who had the particular quality of some people regarding financial discussions, which was to understand the broad outlines of a situation without pressing for details that felt like they belonged to my private life rather than our shared one, had never specifically raised my grandmother's property with his family, and I had never volunteered the information. Eleanor, who had strong opinions about most things and communicated them with the comfortable confidence of someone accustomed to being the most financially established person in any room she occupied, had therefore spent 4 years of my marriage operating under a set of assumptions about my financial situation that were considerably more modest than the reality. She assumed, I think, that I was a graphic designer of ordinary means who had married her son, contributed a child from a previous relationship to the family equation, and occupied roughly the economic position that her other daughters-in-law occupied, dependent, in the way that most people are dependent, on the family's collective goodwill and resources. What she didn't know was that the house her family gathered in for Christmas dinner every single year, the house that had been the Hartley family's traditional holiday gathering place for over 2 decades, the house where every grandchild's first Christmas photograph had been taken, the house Eleanor referred to, casually and consistently, as the family home, had been my grandmother's property before it became mine. My grandmother, in one of the coincidences that sometimes feel too pointed to be entirely accidental, had lived 3 houses down from where Eleanor Hartley currently resided. They had known each other for decades, had the complicated relationship of long-term neighbors who respected each other without ever becoming particularly close. When my grandmother died and left me her estate, Eleanor had attended the funeral and offered her condolences without apparently connecting my grandmother's property with anything that might eventually be relevant to her own family's comfortable assumptions about the landscape they inhabited. The tenants in my grandmother's house, the 3 houses from Eleanor's, had given notice 4 months before that Christmas dinner, planning to relocate for work reasons. This meant the property was sitting empty at the time of that holiday gathering, something I had been quietly considering what to do with, weighing options that included finding new tenants, selling, or potentially other arrangements that I hadn't yet fully decided on. What made the property particularly significant to the Hartley family gathering situation, beyond simply its financial value, was Eleanor's own house. Eleanor's house, the one she'd lived in for 30 years, the one that had hosted 30 years of Hartley family Christmases, was aging in ways that had become increasingly difficult to manage. The heating system had failed twice in the past 3 years. The roof needed significant work that Eleanor's fixed retirement income made challenging to address quickly. The property required ongoing maintenance that, increasingly, Eleanor relied on Marcus and his brother to help with, both financially and practically, visits to handle repairs, contributions toward costs that she didn't quite ask for directly but that everyone understood were necessary. Eleanor's plan, which she had discussed with Marcus and his brother separately from me on several occasions that I was aware of through what Marcus shared afterward, was to sell her house within the next 2 or 3 years and move into something smaller, more manageable, easier to maintain on a fixed income. In the interim period before that sale, she had begun making increasing comments about the empty property 3 houses down, my grandmother's property, though she didn't know it was mine, noting that it was a shame such a large, beautiful house was sitting empty, wondering aloud what the owners planned to do with it, mentioning once that it would be an ideal location for a family gathering space or for older relatives who needed more room than a smaller property could provide. She was, without realizing it, publicly expressing interest in a property that I owned. This was the secret I carried into that Christmas dinner, watching my daughter eat alone at a card table in the corner of a sunroom, 12 feet from a table full of people who had decided she wasn't quite real family. The secret that the house Eleanor's family would need next year, and the year after, and very possibly the year after that, belonged to the woman whose daughter was currently eating Christmas dinner off mismatched plates at a card table in the corner. Now let me take you back through the 4 years of smaller moments that preceded that Christmas dinner, because understanding why I hadn't yet acted on this information requires understanding exactly how gradually, how precisely, the Hartley family had communicated their position to me. The first year of my marriage to Marcus, Eleanor had been, by the standards I would eventually learn to apply to her behavior, relatively welcoming. She had accepted my presence in Marcus's life with the particular graciousness of someone making a generous accommodation rather than simply acknowledging an obvious reality, but she had been pleasant at family gatherings, had asked Sophie appropriate grandmotherly questions, had included us in holiday plans without visible reluctance. The differential treatment began emerging in year 2, so gradually that I genuinely struggled, for months, to determine whether I was perceiving something real or constructing grievances from ordinary family dynamics that simply required more time to fully integrate. Marcus's brother David had a wife named Catherine, whom Eleanor had known for 15 years before David and Catherine even married, a family friend whose children Eleanor had watched grow up and whose presence in the Hartley family felt, in every observable way, like the presence of someone who had always been there. Catherine called Eleanor Mom, without apparent self-consciousness, referenced family history I'd never witnessed with easy familiarity. Occupied the particular position of someone for whom belonging to this family required no effort because it had simply always been assumed. I watched this dynamic carefully during that second year of my marriage, trying to understand whether the difference in how Eleanor related to Catherine versus how she related to me was simply the natural result of a 15-year head start, or whether it reflected something more specifically about my own position in Eleanor's understanding of who counted as real family. By year 3, I had enough specific evidence to make a tentative conclusion. There was the Christmas when Eleanor gave each grandchild a handmade ornament for the tree, crafted by a local artisan she'd commissioned specifically for this gift, each one personalized with the child's name and birth year. 6 grandchildren received these ornaments. Sophie did not. When I mentioned this to Marcus afterward, he said he'd talk to his mother. The following Christmas, Sophie received an ornament. It had her name on it, but not her birth year, a detail that seemed too specific to be accidental, as though someone had ordered a 7th ornament but hadn't provided, or hadn't remembered, or hadn't bothered to confirm, the specific personal detail that made the gift genuinely individual rather than simply remedially inclusive. There was the family portrait session Eleanor organized for her 70th birthday, hiring a professional photographer to document the Hartley family for a large print she planned to hang in her hallway. The photographer, following Eleanor's direction, arranged the family in a specific configuration, Eleanor at the center, her children and their spouses arranged around her, grandchildren in front. Sophie was positioned, in this arrangement, slightly apart from the cluster of other grandchildren, not excluded exactly, but placed in a way that created a subtle visual distinction between her and the children Eleanor's photographer appeared to consider the primary subjects. I noticed this in the proofs Eleanor shared with us weeks after the session, the specific geometry of how Sophie had been placed relative to everyone else, and I showed the photos to Marcus with a question rather than an accusation. "Do you notice anything about where Sophie is in these?" I asked. Marcus looked at them for a long moment. "She's a little off to the side," he said carefully. "Yes," I said. "I think it's just how the photographer arranged things," he said. "These compositions can be complicated with large groups." "The photographer arranged things according to how Eleanor directed," I said. "That's what photographers do." Marcus didn't have a response to this that satisfied either of us, and the conversation ended in the particular way that these conversations consistently ended during our marriage, with Marcus acknowledging that something wasn't entirely right without being willing to pursue the confrontation that actually addressing it would require. His reluctance to confront his mother wasn't something I attributed to malice or indifference to my feelings or Sophie's. I think Marcus genuinely loved both of us and genuinely found Eleanor's behavior troubling when he allowed himself to fully acknowledge it. What he struggled with was the specific courage required to tell his mother, directly and with real consequences, that her treatment of his daughter was unacceptable. Eleanor was, to put it plainly, frightening in the way that certain very confident, very established older women can be frightening, not through explicit threats or obvious cruelty, but through the particular social authority of someone who has always been the most powerful person in the room and has arranged circumstances to ensure this remains true. Confronting Eleanor risked a dynamic that Marcus had been navigating carefully his entire adult life, the withdrawal of the particular maternal warmth that had always been the primary reward for compliance with her preferences. He had watched, over decades, how Eleanor related to people who crossed her in meaningful ways, and the picture was not encouraging. So he told her, I assumed, in soft and easily deflected terms that allowed her to continue her behavior without genuine acknowledgement of what she was actually doing, and then he told me he'd spoken to her, and the cycle continued. The incident that finally exhausted my capacity for this cycle wasn't dramatic. It was almost comically small in isolation, which I think is precisely why it became the thing that finally broke through the careful rationalization I'd been maintaining for years. Sophie had written a school essay about her family, assigned as part of a unit on personal history. Her teacher had encouraged students to bring in photographs to accompany their essays, and Sophie had assembled a small collection, photos of Marcus and me, of her cousins, of various family gatherings. She'd included the Hartley family Christmas portrait, the professional one from Eleanor's 70th birthday, and she'd written, in the essay, about feeling like part of a big family. Eleanor, who had heard about the essay through Marcus's brother David, whose daughter was in the same class, made a comment at a subsequent family gathering that I don't think she intended me to hear, or perhaps didn't particularly care whether I heard. She used the family portrait for her school project, Eleanor said to David's wife Catherine, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone discussing something that required careful handling. I thought that was sweet. Though of course she's not really capturing the whole picture of what the family is she? It's complicated, these blended situations. I was in the adjacent kitchen. Eleanor was in the dining room. The distance between us was approximately 8 feet and an open doorway. I stood at that kitchen counter for a moment, processing what I'd just heard, and then I made myself a cup of tea and went back to the gathering and said nothing, the way I had said nothing dozens of times before when Eleanor communicated, in one way or another, that Sophie existed in some complicated, peripheral category rather than simply as Marcus's daughter. But something crystallized in me that afternoon, listening to Eleanor describe my daughter's school essay as not really capturing the whole picture of the family. I thought about the empty property 3 houses away. I thought about Eleanor's expressed interest in what the owners planned to do with it. And I began, for the first time with genuine seriousness, to think about what I actually planned. I did not make a dramatic announcement. I did not arrange a confrontation designed to humiliate Eleanor in front of her family. I did not send a letter, or make a phone call, or engineer any specific moment of revelation that could have been characterized, afterward, as calculated revenge. What I did was considerably simpler, considerably quieter, and, I think, considerably more effective than any of those approaches would have been. I called my property manager. This happened approximately 3 weeks after that Christmas dinner, on a Tuesday morning when Sophie was at school and Marcus was at work and I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the particular clarity that comes from having finally made a decision you've been approaching slowly for months without quite arriving. I've decided what I want to do with the Harrison property, I told my property manager, using the name I'd always used for my grandmother's house, her maiden name, a habit I'd developed during the estate administration that had simply persisted. I'm not going to relist it for tenants. I'm going to move forward with the renovation plans we discussed last year, and then I'm going to decide about long-term use from there. The renovation plans in question were something my property manager and I had discussed in general terms several times over the preceding years, a comprehensive update of the Victorian house that would address the deferred maintenance that decades of rental tenancy had accumulated, restore some of the original architectural features that previous owners had covered or removed, and generally bring the property to a condition that reflected its actual potential rather than its current state of managed, practical functionality. This renovation would take approximately 6 to 8 months to complete, my property manager estimated, and would require the property to be entirely unoccupied during that period, no tenants, no casual use, no visitors. I authorized the renovation that Tuesday morning. I did not tell Eleanor about any of this. What I did tell Marcus, that same evening, was considerably more direct than anything I'd said to him previously about his mother's treatment of Sophie. "I need to talk to you about something," I said, after Sophie had gone to bed and we were sitting in our kitchen in the specific quiet of a weekday evening when difficult conversations become possible in ways they aren't during the busier hours of family life. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, reading something in my tone that signaled this was different from our ordinary end-of-day conversations. "I've been thinking about Christmas dinner," I said. "About the card table. About Sophie eating alone in the corner of the sunroom while every Hartley by blood sat at the main table." Marcus was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone who has been expecting a conversation and is now navigating how to begin it. "I know that was wrong," he said. "I should have said something at the time. I was going to talk to my mother." "Marcus," I said, gently but firmly, "I've heard that sentence many times over the past 4 years, and I've watched it produce essentially no change in how your mother treats our daughter. I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it rather than immediately planning how to manage your mother's reaction to it." He nodded, slowly. "I own the Harrison property," I said. "The Victorian house on Elmwood, 3 houses from your mother's. It was my grandmother's. She left it to me. I've owned it for 3 years." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, processing this. "I knew about your inheritance," he said carefully. "I didn't realize the specific property. I should have been clearer about that when it came up," I acknowledged. "I think I avoided the specific detail partly because I wasn't sure what to do with it, and partly because I could see, even then, that the Hartley family's relationship with that property was complicated in ways I wasn't ready to navigate." "What do you mean, complicated?" "I mean that your mother has expressed interest in that property on multiple occasions. I mean that she's been making plans to sell her own house, and that property, my property, is one she's clearly been considering in relation to those plans. I mean that the house your family gathers in every Christmas has been sitting 3 houses away from her entire life, and she's been discussing what the mysterious owners might do with it, without knowing that she was discussing my inheritance with me." Marcus sat with this information for a long, quiet moment. "What are you planning to do with it?" he asked finally. "I've authorized a full renovation," I said. 6 to 8 months of work. After that, I'll decide on long-term use. But I want to be clear about something, Marcus. Whatever I decide to do with that property will be informed, directly, by what happens in this family regarding Sophie. Your mother set up a separate table for our daughter at Christmas dinner. A card table in the corner of the sunroom, with paper tablecloth and mismatched plates, while every other child in the family sat at the main table on proper chairs with real china. "I know," he said quietly. "I need you to understand that I'm not going to continue absorbing that kind of treatment indefinitely," I said. "And I need you to understand that the assets I bring to this family are real, significant, and directly relevant to your family's future plans in ways that nobody on your side seems to have accounted for." This was the most direct I had ever been with Marcus about any of this, and watching his expression as the full picture assembled itself in his understanding, I recognized something I hadn't been certain of before that conversation, that Marcus, at some level, had been operating under the same assumption as Eleanor, the comfortable assumption that I was primarily the recipient of the Hartley family's generosity rather than someone who brought her own substantial resources to the equation. That assumption, I understood now, had allowed him to defer his mother's behavior towards Sophie with a casualness that he would not have maintained if he'd fully understood the actual landscape of our family's resources. What happened next unfolded over approximately 8 weeks following that kitchen conversation, during which Marcus, apparently galvanized by the clarity of what I'd told him in a way that my previous, gentler communications had failed to achieve, spoke to Eleanor directness I hadn't previously witnessed him deploy with his mother. I don't know exactly what he said to her, because I wasn't present for that conversation and Marcus gave me only a general account afterward. What I know is that Eleanor called me 2 days after Marcus spoke to her, her voice carrying a quality I had genuinely never heard from her before in 4 years of marriage. She was uncertain. Rachel, she said, after a brief exchange of pleasantries that felt, given the circumstances, slightly surreal in their mundane formality, Marcus tells me you own the Harrison property. That's right, I said. Your grandmother was Margaret Harrison, she said, making a connection she clearly hadn't made previously despite having known my grandmother for decades. Yes, I said. There was a pause. I didn't realize, Eleanor said. I knew Margaret, of course. I attended her funeral. I had no idea she was your grandmother. It doesn't come up often, I said, which was both technically true and considerably more generous than Eleanor's lack of attention to my family background probably deserved. I've been making some inquiries about that property, Eleanor said carefully, the specific carefulness of someone suddenly aware that they are on unfamiliar ground. About the owner's plans. I had no idea. I've authorized a renovation, I said. It'll take most of this year. And after the renovation? Eleanor asked, and the question, delivered with all the practiced casualness Eleanor could muster, carried a significance both of us understood precisely. I haven't decided yet, I said. This was true. But it was also the most powerful thing I could have said, more powerful than any specific plan I might have announced, because an undecided future is considerably more motivating than a decided one when you are Eleanor Hartley and you have just discovered that the woman whose daughter you seated at a card table in the corner of your sunroom owns the property you've been making inquiries about for your own future housing plans. Eleanor's next question, which arrived after another brief pause, surprised me with its directness. Rachel, she said, I owe you an apology. And I owe Sophie one too. What I did at Christmas was wrong. I think I've been doing things that were wrong for some time, actually, and I believe I've told myself stories about why they were reasonable that weren't honest. I sat with this for a moment, processing the genuineness of the admission against the obvious context of financial realization that had precipitated it. I appreciate you saying that, I said. I mean it, Eleanor said, and her voice carried something I found, unexpectedly, genuinely credible. I know the timing of this conversation makes it look like I'm saying it because of the property. And I won't pretend that learning about your inheritance didn't prompt me to think about things differently. But I think what it actually did was force me to see something clearly that I'd been avoiding seeing, which is that I've been treating your daughter as though she isn't a full member of this family, and she is. She's Marcus's daughter. She's my granddaughter. The fact that it took learning about your property to make me confront that honestly is something I'm not proud of. This admission, with its acknowledgement of both the genuine wrong and the somewhat ignoble mechanism that had precipitated the acknowledgement, struck me as more honest than any version of the conversation I had anticipated. Eleanor, I said, I think we should probably have a longer conversation at some point, about a lot of things. But I appreciate what you've said tonight. After I ended the call, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the card table in the sunroom, about Sophie's expression when she'd asked me to sit with her, about 4 years of smaller, deniable moments that had assembled into that single undeniable one. And I thought about what I was actually going to do with my grandmother's house. The renovation took 7 months. During those 7 months, the Hartley family's relationship with me shifted in ways that I found both genuinely encouraging and, occasionally, uncomfortably transparent in their motivation, the particular discomfort of watching people treat you with new warmth that is at least partly, if not entirely, generated by financial recalculation rather than genuine moral awakening. Eleanor made visible, consistent effort in the months following our phone call to change specific patterns of behavior regarding Sophie that she had previously maintained without apparent recognition of their impact. The changes were sometimes graceful and sometimes effortful and occasionally slightly awkward in the way that deliberate corrections of unconscious habits often are, but they were real, and they accumulated over those 7 months into something I found myself cautiously, gradually willing to trust as genuine rather than purely strategic. Sophie's school photograph appeared on Eleanor's grandchildren wall within 6 weeks of our phone call, added with a frame that matched the others, placed in the arrangement with the kind of careful, deliberate inclusion that communicated something about the intentionality behind its previous absence. Eleanor didn't announce this change or draw attention to it during our next visit to her house. She simply let it be there, visible, for Sophie to discover herself. Sophie noticed immediately, the particular sharp attention of a 9-year-old who had absorbed, without being entirely conscious of absorbing the information encoded in that wall's previous configuration. "Grandma Eleanor put my picture up," Sophie said, quietly, to me, while Eleanor was in the kitchen making tea and the two of us were standing in the hallway. "I see that," I said. Sophie looked at the photograph for a moment, her expression doing several complicated things at once that I suspect most adults would struggle to fully articulate. "It's my school picture from this year," she said. "The one with the blue background." "It is," I said. She nodded once, with the particular economy of a child who has processed something significant and chosen to process it internally rather than externally, and then she went to find her cousins in the living room. That I stood in that hallway for a moment longer, looking at Sophie's photograph in its matched frame on Eleanor's grandchildren wall, and I felt something complicated that wasn't entirely satisfaction and wasn't entirely grief but contained elements of both. Eleanor's relationship with Sophie during those 7 months developed an incrementally warmer quality that I watched carefully, trying to distinguish genuine connection from strategic performance, understanding that this distinction mattered enormously for how I would eventually think about my grandmother's property. What I observed, over time, was something that resisted simple categorization as either purely genuine or purely strategic. Eleanor was a woman in her 70s who had spent decades operating within a set of family assumptions that she had internalized so thoroughly she'd stopped examining them, and discovering that those assumptions had real, practical consequences had forced a confrontation with her own behavior that seemed, in the specific way she engaged with it, to involve actual reflection rather than merely surface correction. She asked Sophie about school with the specific curiosity of someone actually trying to understand who this child was, rather than the performative engagement of someone going through required motions. She remembered things Sophie mentioned, a book she was reading, a friend she'd had difficulty with, a project she was excited about, and asked follow-up questions at subsequent visits that demonstrated genuine retention rather than polite, forgettable interest. She apologized to Sophie directly, about 4 months after our phone call, in a conversation I wasn't present for and only heard about afterward from Sophie herself. "Grandma Eleanor said sorry to me," Sophie told me, with the slightly confused but genuinely moved expression of a child processing an unexpected adult apology. "What did she say?" I asked. "She said she hadn't always been fair to me, and she wanted me to know she understood that now, and she was going to try to do better," Sophie said. "And she said I was actually her granddaughter, like really her granddaughter, not just because of Dad but because that's what I am." I thought about Eleanor having this conversation with my 9-year-old daughter, finding the words to acknowledge to a child that she had treated her unfairly, and I felt something toward my mother-in-law that was more generous than what I'd been feeling for most of the preceding 4 years. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't retroactively make the card table acceptable or the missing school photograph reasonable or the years of smaller, deniable differential treatment insignificant. But it was real, and it was directed at the right person, and Sophie received it with the particular grace children sometimes extend to adults who admit they were wrong, a generosity of spirit that I found both moving and slightly humbling given how much more complicated my own forgiveness process was proving. Marcus, throughout this period, changed in ways that I think mattered more to me, personally, than Eleanor's changes, simply because his relationship with Sophie was more immediate and daily than his mother's, and because his previous pattern of deferring to Eleanor's behavior had been, in my experience of it, the more consistently painful dimension of this situation. He had, in the weeks following our kitchen conversation, begun addressing his mother's behavior with a directness I hadn't previously seen him deploy, calling things by their names rather than allowing himself the comfortable ambiguity of soft suggestions that Eleanor could and did absorb without genuine response. "I've been letting this go on for years," he told me, during one of the more honest conversations our marriage had produced in some time, "because confronting my mother felt harder than watching you and Sophie absorb whatever she did. That was a cowardly calculation, and I'm sorry for it. I kept telling myself that things would naturally improve, or that I was managing things with her in ways that would eventually produce change, but what I was actually doing was protecting myself from a difficult conversation at your expense." This admission, with its specific acknowledgement of the mechanism of his avoidance rather than simply a general apology for outcomes, was the kind of honest self-examination that I had, in the previous 4 years of our marriage, stopped expecting from Marcus regarding his mother. "What changed?" I asked. "Honestly," he said. "Finding out about your grandmother's property. Not because of the financial implications, although I won't pretend those weren't clarifying. But because it made me realize, in a way I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before, that I'd been operating under an unconscious assumption that my family was doing you and Sophie a favor by including you, rather than understanding that you brought everything to this marriage that I did, and more, and that my mother's treatment of Sophie wasn't just unkind, it was genuinely wrong in ways I'd been too comfortable to fully confront. I thought about this conversation for a long time afterward, about the particular ways that financial reality had illuminated moral reality in this situation, the uncomfortable but perhaps unavoidable fact that people sometimes need to understand the practical weight of their assumptions before they're willing to examine the ethical weight. The decision about my grandmother's property took the full 7 months of renovation to arrive at, and when it came not from any single conversation or dramatic moment of clarity but from the accumulated observation of 7 months of changed behavior and genuine, if imperfect, effort that I decided not to sell. I decided not to rent to external tenants. What I decided, after 7 months of watching Eleanor add a photograph to a wall and apologize to a 9-year-old and ask genuine follow-up questions about a book my daughter was reading, was to offer a long-term arrangement to Eleanor that was neither punishment nor unconditional gift, but something that reflected the actual, complicated reality of where our family had arrived. I offered Eleanor the use of my grandmother's renovated house, at below market rate, on a long-term arrangement that included specific, explicit terms that I discussed openly with Marcus and, in appropriate terms for the conversation, with Eleanor herself. These terms were not punitive. They did not reference the Christmas dinner or the card table or any specific past incident. They were simply the terms under which I was willing to make a property I owned available to a family member, terms that reflected my expectation of how family members should treat each other, articulated clearly and in advance rather than assumed and violated. Eleanor accepted these terms. Whether she accepted them from genuine changed values, from practical necessity, or from some complicated mixture of both, I have stopped trying to determine with certainty, because I think that question is less important than the observable, daily reality of how she actually behaves. The first Christmas dinner after Eleanor moved into my grandmother's renovated Victorian house was held there, in that house, in a dining room large enough to accommodate the entire Hartley family at a single, properly set table. Every child had a proper seat. Sophie sat between her father and her cousin Emma, at the main table, with the family's actual china and actual linens, and Eleanor passed her the gravy boat first, before anyone else, a small gesture that I don't think Sophie assigned particular significance to but that I noticed with a fullness of feeling that I hadn't been entirely prepared for. I want to be honest about what resolution actually looks like in a situation like this, because I think there's a version of this story that ends with everything perfectly healed, all damage repaired, all complicated feelings resolved into uncomplicated warmth, and that version would be dishonest. Eleanor and I have a relationship that I would describe as genuinely improved, carefully maintained, and permanently changed in ways that sometimes feel like progress and sometimes feel like the specific sadness of understanding too clearly how things were before. I am cordial with her in ways I mean rather than perform. I extend her the benefit of the doubt she previously failed to extend my daughter. I do not expect more from her than she has demonstrated she's capable of, which means I am rarely disappointed and occasionally, genuinely, pleasantly surprised. Sophie, at 11 years old now, has a relationship with Eleanor that looks, from the outside, like an ordinary grandparent-grandchild relationship, full of the specific warmth and gentle friction of people who are genuinely attached and occasionally aggravating to each other in the comfortable way of people who feel secure enough to be imperfect. Whether Sophie carries anything from those earlier years, the card table, the missing photograph, the accumulated smaller moments she registered without fully processing, is something I don't know with certainty and probably won't until she's old enough to articulate whatever she absorbed. What I try to give her is the specific reassurance of watching her mother refuse to allow her to be treated as less than she is, the particular security of knowing that the adults responsible for her will not simply absorb whatever treatment comes their way in the interest of keeping an uncomfortable peace. My grandmother's house, beautifully renovated, sits 3 houses from where Eleanor now lives in a smaller, more manageable property she finally sold after moving her gathering space into the Victorian. The dining room table in my grandmother's house seats 14 comfortably, and every Christmas, 11 members of the Hartley family fill 12 of those seats, leaving 2 for any configuration of the future that presents itself. Sophie always has one of them. If you've ever found yourself quietly absorbing the weight of being treated as less than you are, by people who assumed, incorrectly, that they held all the resources and all the power in the relationship. I hope this story reminds you that the most effective response to that treatment is rarely dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it is simply allowing people to discover, in their own time and through their own gradually dawning understanding, exactly whose house they were planning to need next year. Leave a comment if this resonated with you. Tell me about a moment when the people who underestimated you finally understood what they'd been missing. Subscribe if you want to stay. There are more stories like this one waiting.